Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a question that really challenges a core belief for millions. Did Jesus exist before he was born? We're going to unpack a pretty significant theological perspective that offers a completely different way of reading the story.
You know, for almost 2,000 years, the idea that Jesus was a divine being in heaven who decided to come to earth has been absolutely central to Christian thought. But what if that's a misreading? What if the Bible is actually telling a different story? That's what we're going to explore.
So where does an alternative reading like this even begin? Well, the whole argument is built on a single, powerful idea. That for Christ's mission to even work, he had to be perfectly, completely, 100% human. And this verse from 1 Corinthians kind of sets the whole thing up. It creates this perfect logical symmetry. The thinking goes like this. If a human, Adam, was the one who brought sin and death into the world, then the rescue mission required someone of the exact same standing. It had to be another human. This idea is rooted in this really important Old Testament concept of a kinsman redeemer. See, in Hebrew law, to legally rescue a family member from debt or slavery, you had to be a blood relative. So for Jesus to be our kinsman redeemer, advocates of this view say he couldn't be a hybrid or a celestial being. He had to be family, fully human.
The book of Romans just doubles down on this parallel. It tells this incredible story of two Adams. And for the obedience of the last Adam, that's Jesus, to perfectly cancel out the disobedience of the first Adam, the argument is simple. They had to be of the same kind. A human for a human. It's a one-to-one reversal.
Okay, so this brings us to the really tricky part. If Jesus had to be fully human, then what do we do with all those famous verses that seem to scream that he existed long before his birth? Well, let's take a look at how this perspective rereads them. And we have to start with the big one, right? The opening of John's Gospel. This is, without a doubt, the #1 passage people point to as proof that Christ was pre-existent.
So from this alternative viewpoint, the Logos, or the Word, isn't a person at all. It's a personification, a poetic description of God's eternal plan or his wisdom, kind of like how wisdom is talked about as a woman in the book of Proverbs. So when the Word became flesh, it doesn't mean a person became a person. It means that divine blueprint, that ultimate plan, was finally and perfectly brought to life in the man, Jesus.
Think about it with this analogy. Imagine you're an engineer designing a racetrack. You design every curve, every straightaway, specifically for one perfect race car you have in your mind. Does that car have to exist before you pour the asphalt? No. The entire track is built for the car, which will come later. In the same way, God's plan, the Logos, was centered on Christ, but Christ didn't need to exist before the plan was set in motion. Okay, next up, this line from Colossians. Now, on the surface, firstborn of all creation sounds pretty cut and dry, doesn't it? It sounds like he was the very first thing that God ever made. But the reinterpretation here hinges on the idea that firstborn wasn't always about birth order. Often, it was a title of rank, of supreme importance and inheritance. And the wild part is, the passage seems to define its own term a few verses later, calling Jesus the firstborn from the dead. This view argues that's the real meaning. It's a title of ultimate authority that he earned when he was resurrected. Now let's look at this passage from Philippians about Christ emptying himself. This is another cornerstone of the traditional view. It's usually read as a divine being lowering himself, giving up his heavenly glory to become human. But this perspective flips that on its head. It suggests the humbling process didn't happen from heaven to earth, but took place entirely on earth. It was the journey of a man who went from being a celebrated, acclaimed teacher to being despised, rejected, and ultimately humbled to the lowest possible point, a humiliating death on a cross. So beyond just rereading specific verses, this view also stands on some pretty firm theological logic. Let's dig into how it impacts two massive concepts: God's foreknowledge and the nature of faith itself. The argument can be boiled down to a really sharp, logical point. If God has perfect foreknowledge, then a literal preexistence isn't just unnecessary, it's illogical. Why? Well, think about it. You don't need to foreknow someone who's already there with you. And proponents of this view say 1 Peter basically hands them the smoking gun. It says Christ was foreknown in God's plan before the world began. The word itself, foreknown, implies absence. It suggests he existed in the mind and purpose of God, but not yet in reality. And that leads us to maybe the most critical question of all. If Jesus was a conscious, celestial being who came to earth knowing the whole plan, knowing he would be resurrected, then where was his faith?
how could he genuinely struggle?
This sets up a really stark contrast. On one side, you have a divine being who kind of just goes through the motions, knowing the final outcome. That doesn't require faith. But on the other side, you have a real human being wrestling with gut-wrenching fear in the Garden of Gethsemane, a man who, as the book of Hebrews says, learned obedience through what he suffered. For adherents, that makes his sacrifice and his trust in God infinitely more powerful and relatable.
So, this brings us to the big so what? Why does any of this matter? For those who hold this view, it's not just a minor theological tweak. They believe it fundamentally changes the very nature of Christ's story for the better.
You see, for them, this perspective isn't about diminishing Jesus. It's about elevating him. It makes his humanity real and his obedience truly heroic. It makes his faith something to be emulated, and it makes his sacrifice so much more profound. It also keeps God the Father as the sole, unassisted creator, and it makes that second Adam parallel we talked about make perfect sense.
Ultimately, this whole massive theological argument really comes down to re-examining just a handful of words like logos or firstborn. And it leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. If a belief held for centuries can be challenged by reinterpreting a single word as a title instead of a birth order, what other foundational ideas might also hinge on the turn of a single, powerful phrase? It makes you wonder how much is built on interpretation and what we might find if we dare to look again.